The rain poured like the sky was breaking apart. Arthur Vance's luxury car skidded dangerously close to the cliff edge. Just as a steel beam broke loose from the storm and hurtled toward him, a tiny voice screamed, "Hold on!" He never expected the hands that saved him would belong to a little girl, or that this moment would shatter everything he thought he knew about his past. Before we dive into today's story, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now, and if you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story like this. Arthur Vance, a 30-year-old millionaire CEO with piercing blue eyes and sleek black hair styled to perfection, steered his gleaming black sedan along the narrow, winding roads that cut through the mist-shrouded hills, the kind of roads where one wrong turn could mean disaster. The leather interior smelled faintly of cedar and cologne, but even the familiar luxury couldn't soothe the irritation etched into his features as the sky unleashed a relentless torrent, rain hammering his windshield so violently the wipers struggled to keep pace, each screech of the blades a sharp reminder of the storm's fury, while deep rumbles of thunder shook the glass and seemed to vibrate through his chest, and when he glanced at the phone beside him for the umpteenth time, the mocking words "no signal" glowed back at him, severing his connection to the world and trapping him alone in nature's chaos. Muttering under his breath, he adjusted his tie, forcing himself to focus on the road ahead where slick asphalt wound like a serpent between the slopes, the guardrails glistening with rain as water gushed down from the hillsides in muddy rivulets. And though his car purred with effortless power, he kept a cautious pace, aware of the treacherous bends ahead. A jagged flash of lightning briefly painted the world in stark white, revealing the twisted metal of an old sign bent by the wind, and then came the sound, low at first, like a distant growl, growing into a violent roar that made his pulse quicken, prompting him to lower his window an inch despite the sheets of rain, the cool, damp air rushing in as the ominous rumble swelled until, without warning, a sharp, deafening crack split the air so loud it made him flinch. His gaze snapped to the slope ahead just in time to see it give way in a sudden landslide, an avalanche of mud, rocks, and shattered tree limbs cascading toward the road with a terrifying speed, and instinct took over as he slammed the brakes, the tires screeching and skidding over the slick surface, the back of the car fishtailing violently before he jerked the wheel to swerve around a massive boulder that smashed into the road and shattered the guardrail. But the maneuver sent his sedan sliding toward the cliff's edge, the front wheels tipping into empty space as his stomach dropped, the horizon tilting and the river far below swirling like a churning maw. For a suspended, breathless moment, the car balanced on the edge of oblivion, engine humming softly as rain drummed against the metal before the rear wheels caught on crumbling earth, the entire chassis groaning under its own weight, and he reached for the gear shift, trying to reverse, only for the tires to spin helplessly in the mud, flinging wet earth into the void. Then came another sound, not from the storm, not from his car, but a long, metallic groan from somewhere above, a sound that vibrated through his bones, compelling him to tilt his head upward through the rain until his eyes found the skeletal frame of an unfinished construction site clinging to the hillside, where the wind had torn a massive steel beam loose from its supports, leaving it to dangle from fraying cables that strained and screeched with each gust. The beam swung dangerously, glinting in the erratic flashes of lightning, each sway carrying it closer to his precarious position, and though every instinct urged him to move, the knowledge that even a shift in weight could send the sedan plunging into the abyss rooted him to the seat, breath shallow, hands clenched white around the wheel. Another bolt of lightning split the sky, and in its stark illumination, he saw the frayed metal threads snapping one by one, the final tether unraveling as the beam twisted in the wind like a pendulum of doom, until, with a piercing snap, it broke free completely, gravity seizing its massive weight, sending it plummeting toward him through the storm with a speed that made his pulse freeze, its sharp edges spinning, the air around it whistling from the force, closing the distance between life and death in a heartbeat. From the hillside, Luna's small frame appeared against the wild canvas of storm and wind, her golden hair whipping across her face in wet strands, her pink frock plastered to her skin by the relentless rain, and her wide blue eyes locked in horror on the sight below, a car dangling like a toy at the edge of the cliff, the ground beneath it crumbling, the roar of the storm echoing like a living beast in her ears. Her little chest rose and fell quickly, her heart pounding so hard she could almost hear it over the thunder, but she didn't stop to think about fear, danger, or what might happen to her. All she knew was that someone was about to die if she didn't act. Spinning on her heel, her boots splashed through puddles, sending arcs of muddy water behind her as she dashed toward the weathered wooden shed behind her family's small cabin, the hinges screeching in protest as she shoved the door open, the smell of damp earth and rope oil filling her nose. Her small hands fumbled for the thickest rope coiled in the corner, its coarse fibers scratching her freezing fingers as she yanked it free, the heavy coil nearly knocking her off balance, but she tightened her jaw, set her shoulders, and turned back toward the cliff. The wind tore at her slight frame, pushing against her like invisible hands trying to stop her, and the slick mud under her boots slid treacherously, but she pushed forward, one step after another, lungs burning with each breath. From behind, a higher-pitched voice rang out, trembling and urgent. "Luna, it's dangerous!" And she risked a glance back to see Elara, her younger sister, standing in the open cabin doorway with wide, terrified eyes, her small hands clutching the frame as though she could anchor herself against the storm. Luna's own fear flickered red in her mind for a heartbeat, but she swallowed it down, turned away, and pressed on, her focus fixed entirely on the oak tree rooted deep into the hillside, its thick trunk standing unmoved by the storm's rage, like a silent guardian. Her fingers, stiff from cold, struggled with the rope as she wrapped it around the trunk, rainwater dripping from her nose and chin, her breaths coming fast and hot in the frigid air, and with a grunt she pulled the knot tight, testing it with all the force her small arms could muster. Satisfied it would hold, she grabbed the free end and charged toward the slope, the car below rocking slightly in the wind, the man inside barely visible through the sheets of water. The mud gave way under her feet, sliding her several inches toward the edge, but she planted her heels hard, fighting for balance, every muscle in her tiny body screaming in effort. A deafening metallic crash split the air as the steel beams slammed into the earth just inches from the car's hood, shards of twisted metal flying outward like deadly shrapnel, one jagged piece slicing through the rain so close she felt it flick against the wet fabric of her sleeve. She flinched but didn't stop, her gaze snapping to the man inside, his blue eyes wide with shock, his face pale under the dim glow of the dashboard, his expression a mix of disbelief and desperate hope. She planted herself in the muck, bracing both feet, the rope burning into her palms as she pulled, each tug feeling like she was trying to drag the entire mountain toward her. Elara had reached the oak now, her smaller hands grabbing the rope behind Luna's, lending whatever strength she could, her lips pressed together in silent determination despite the fear in her eyes. The wind screamed in their ears, rain running into their mouths and stinging their eyes, but they didn't let go, their bodies straining, the rope trembling under the combined pull of the two sisters and the weight of the luxury sedan. Luna could feel her arms going numb, her fingers slipping slightly with every surge of strain, the coarse fibers grinding painfully into her skin until she could feel rawness forming beneath, but she refused to loosen her grip. The ground beneath her boots shifted again, sending her sliding forward a fraction of an inch, her toes now flirting dangerously close to the muddy slope that would lead to the cliff. She gritted her teeth, the taste of rain and mud heavy in her mouth, her breath loud in her own ears, and yanked again with everything she had, the muscles in her back tightening as though they might snap. Arthur's gaze met hers through the rain, his lips moving, but the wind tore away his words before they reached her. She didn't need to hear them. She understood the plea in his eyes. Elara whimpered softly, the sound almost lost in the chaos, her feet slipping slightly before she dug in again, her small frame quivering from the effort. The rope jerked suddenly, sending a fresh wave of pain through Luna's arms as she fought to hold it steady, but the rain-slick fibers betrayed her grip, sliding against her raw skin until she felt the knot at the tree shudder and the free end inch its way through her desperate grasp. She gasped, the reality hitting her like a punch. The rope was slipping, and if she couldn't stop it, the man in the car would be lost forever. Arthur's breath came in ragged bursts, the roar of the wind and rain drowning out every other sound except the frantic pounding of his own heart. The car groaned beneath him, its frame shifting as the cliff edge broke away bit by bit, stone and soil tumbling into the void below with a hollow, echoing crash. The rope trembled in his grasp, slick with rain, cutting into his palms, yet he clung to it with a desperation born from pure survival. "Kid, you can't," he began, his voice hoarse, but Luna's fierce cry cut through the storm like a blade. "Don't talk, climb!" Her tiny voice was firm, almost commanding, carrying a weight far beyond her 6 years, and for a moment, Arthur's mind reeled at how this little slip of a girl could sound like a soldier in battle. Behind her, Elara's feet dug deep into the sucking mud, her small hands gripping the rope so tightly her knuckles were white, rain streaming down her round cheeks as she fought to keep the lifeline taut. Every gust of wind threatened to yank Arthur backward, the pull of gravity mocking his every movement. He forced the car door open, each creak of its hinges sounding like a countdown to his end, and moved with painstaking slowness, knowing that one careless shift of weight could turn this rescue into a tragedy. His fingers wrapped around the rope, as if it were the last thread tying him to the world above, and he began to climb, inch by agonizing inch, boots slipping on the wet rock. The cold bit into his bones, water soaking him to the core, every muscle screaming in protest. His shoulder brushed the jagged cliff wall, sending a spray of sharp gravel into the void, and for one terrifying second, his foot found nothing but air. The rope jerked violently, and the ground beneath him cracked like splitting ice. His body swung sideways, slamming into the cliffside, the pain radiating through his ribs. But then, there it was. A hand. Tiny, trembling, mud-stained fingers curled around his wrist with a grip so fierce it defied their size. He looked up into Luna's eyes, wide with determination and glistening with raindrops and something else. A strange, unshakable recognition. "I've got you!" she shouted over the storm, and though her voice was small, it was iron-strong. Elara leaned back with all her weight, her boots sinking deeper into the sodden ground as she anchored the rope, her lips pressed together in silent fear. Arthur gritted his teeth and pushed upward, the bark of the oak tree looming solemn. Loser, his heart thundering against his ribs. The wind howled, the rain pounded, but with one final desperate pull, he dragged himself over the edge, collapsing onto the muddy ground. He lay there, coughing violently, spitting out grit and rainwater, every breath feeling like a battle won. His vision blurred for a moment, the gray clouds spinning above him, and then he felt the rope go slack beside him, the girls kneeling just a foot away. They didn't move toward him right away, they only stared, their faces pale but their eyes fixed on his like they were reading something on his very soul. Luna's breathing was uneven, her small chest rising and falling rapidly, but her gaze was steady, unflinching, filled with something between shock and certainty. Elara clutched her sister's sleeve, peering at him with a mixture of fear and awe, her lips parting as if to speak but no sound coming out. The rain eased for a fleeting moment, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth, and in that strange, suspended silence, Arthur felt the weight of their eyes. It wasn't just curiosity, it wasn't even just concern, it was as though they already knew who he was, as though they had been waiting for him all along. Arthur's breath still came in ragged bursts as the rain pattered against the roof of the small wooden cabin, the storm outside growling like a living thing desperate to break in. Yet here inside, the air was thick with a strange mix of warmth and tension. Luna's voice, soft but firm, broke through the haze in his head as she said, "You'll get sick out here." Her tone more of a command than a suggestion, and before he could protest, she was already tugging at his sleeve, leading him toward the crackling glow that flickered beyond the slightly ajar door, her small hand surprisingly steady despite the tremor of exhaustion in her limbs, while Elara stayed behind just long enough to kick mud off her boots before following them in, her wide eyes never leaving Arthur's face as if searching for something familiar. The moment he crossed the threshold, the storm's icy fingers released him, replaced instantly by the gentle embrace of heat from the fireplace, its amber light dancing on the worn wooden walls and casting shadows that seemed to breathe with the flames. And yet, instead of comfort, Arthur felt a ripple of unease. He didn't belong here, and yet, he wasn't being treated like a stranger, not exactly. Elara disappeared briefly into another room and returned with a folded bundle of dry clothes, setting them in his lap without a word, her gaze shy but observant, and Arthur muttered a quiet, "Thank you," his voice hoarse, almost swallowed by the hiss of the fire. Luna, already moving with the efficiency of someone used to caring for others, ladled steaming soup into a chipped ceramic bowl, the savory scent of herbs and broth curling through the air, and when she handed it to him, he noticed her small hands trembling, not from fear, but from sheer exhaustion after the dangerous rescue they'd just pulled off, and the sight of it made his throat tighten unexpectedly. Taking a cautious sip, he felt warmth spread through his chest, but alongside it came a slow, creeping curiosity. Where were their parents, and why were two girls alone in such a storm, risking themselves for a stranger? And that curiosity grew heavier with each moment until his eyes began to wander over the modest little room. There was no clutter, only the bare necessities: a small table by the window with a vase holding 2 dried flowers, a rocking chair with a neatly folded blanket, shelves with a few well-worn books, and, above the stone mantel, a single framed photograph whose presence dominated the space more than the fire itself. At first, it was the warm glow in the picture that caught his attention, a captured moment that radiated joy. But then, his gaze focused, and froze. The woman in the photo was smiling with that familiar half-tilt of her head, the way she always did when trying to stifle a laugh, her eyes carrying that same spark of mischief he once fell in love with, and Arthur's chest constricted so violently he almost set the soup down for fear of spilling it, because this was impossible, utterly impossible. She was his late wife, gone for years, yet here she was in this frame, her arms cradling 2 tiny babies, both with golden hair that caught the light even in a faded image, and both with the unmistakable blue eyes that stared back at him like tiny mirrors of his own. Arthur's heartbeat pounded in his ears, the cabin walls seeming to close in, the warmth of the fire suddenly oppressive, his mind spinning with questions that collided and tangled. How could this photo exist here, with these girls, in this place? And before he could form a single word, before he could even tear his eyes away, Luna and Elara exchanged a quick, almost nervous glance, as if they already knew what he had just seen, as if they had been waiting for the moment he would notice, and that silent understanding between them was somehow more unsettling than the storm raging outside. Arthur's feet felt as if they had turned to stone, but somehow they dragged him toward the mantel, his trembling hand reaching out toward the faded photograph as though touching it might explain away the impossible. His voice broke apart mid-breath, raw and unsteady. Where did you get this?" The words seemed to hang in the warm air of the cabin, clashing against the steady crackle of the fire, the sound almost mocking the storm raging in his chest. Luna tilted her small face toward him, a frown gathering between her brows, her voice innocent, yet heavy with something he couldn't name. "That's Mommy. She died when we were little." For a heartbeat, Arthur's mind went blank. Then, without warning, a flood of memories surged, unstoppable, each one sharper than the last. His wife's laugh echoing through their old home, her delicate fingers tracing the line of his jaw, the way her golden hair would glow in the afternoon light as though it were spun from the very sun. He remembered leaving for that business trip years ago, the rush to catch his flight, the phone call in the middle of a hotel night telling him there'd been an accident, the flat voice on the other end saying she didn't survive, the crushing silence that followed. No one had ever mentioned children. His breath caught, his chest tightening until he felt he might choke. The wooden floor beneath his feet felt like it was tilting, his vision blurring at the edges as if the entire world had been pulled into a whirlpool and he was sinking fast. The fire popped in the hearth, startling him, grounding him for just a moment, and when his eyes focused again, the girls were staring, 2 sets of wide, identical blue eyes rimmed with worry, and something like recognition. Elara's soft voice, hesitant and fragile as a leaf in the wind, broke the thick air between them. "Why are you crying?" Arthur's lips parted, but no words came out. The lump in his throat was too heavy, his emotions too tangled, and his thoughts spun in dizzying circles. Was this some cruel mistake? A trick? Or had the life he thought he knew been nothing more than a carefully built lie? His hands shook as he gripped the edge of the mantel to keep from collapsing under the weight of it all. Then, without warning, Luna's small frame darted out of sight, her footsteps quick and determined down the short hallway. The quiet stretched, broken only by the restless shifting of Elara beside him and the distant patter of rain on the roof, until Luna returned, her tiny fingers clutching something so tightly he could see the whiteness of her knuckles. She stepped closer, her eyes locked on his, and slowly opened her hand to reveal a tarnished silver locket, its hinges worn, the chain slightly knotted as though it had been hidden away for years. With trembling care, she pressed it into his palm, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mommy said this was important." Arthur's heart pounded as he fumbled with the clasp, the metal cold against his skin, until it finally clicked open, and there, staring back at him from the tiny frame inside, was his own face, younger, smiling, alive in a way he hadn't been in years. His knees weakened, his breath came in shallow bursts, and his mind screamed with questions he wasn't ready to face, because the truth was clawing its way toward him, and once it surfaced, there would be no going back. Arthur's breath trembled as he pried open the delicate gold locket, the hinges creaking like a whisper from another lifetime, and there, staring back at him, was a tiny photograph he knew by heart, the one he had slipped into his wife's hand the night he asked her to marry him, when her tears had glistened in the candlelight and she had promised they'd never spend a night apart. The sight of it now was like a dagger to the chest, a cruel reminder that time had not only stolen her, but also the years he should have spent with her children, years he never even knew existed, and his voice cracked in disbelief as he choked. Your mother kept this?" Luna's wide, innocent eyes held no suspicion, only the quiet truth of a child who had grown up on fragments of love, and she nodded slowly, her braids swaying gently, her voice small yet piercing as she said, "She told us Daddy was far away, but one day he'd find us." And in that moment, Arthur felt the weight of every heartbeat he had missed, every birthday candle he hadn't blown out beside them, every scraped knee he hadn't kissed better, guilt pouring into him like cold rain, making his chest ache as if it might cave in under the sheer force of regret. His mind spun wildly, grasping for an explanation, and images flashed like lightning, his wife's laughter in their kitchen, the sound of her voice over the phone before that trip, the dreadful call from a stranger saying there had been an accident, the flat tone that told him she hadn't survived, the funeral he was never allowed to see, the grave that never felt real because they'd refused him a final goodbye. Now all of it seemed like a web of lies, expertly spun to keep him away, and his heart thundered in his ears as a more terrifying question rose like a shadow from the depths. Who had done this to him, and why had they stolen not just his wife but the very blood of his blood? His hands shook harder, the locket trembling between his fingers, and he looked at Luna with desperate eyes, the kind of eyes that begged for the truth, even if it would destroy him. His voice barely more than a whisper. "Sweetheart, who told you that?" Luna glanced at Elara, as if deciding whether the truth was safe here, and the room seemed to hold its breath, every creak of the old floorboards magnified, every distant hum of the refrigerator sounding like a drumbeat counting down to something inevitable. Ara's little hand clutched her sister's, as if lending her courage, and then Luna's lips parted, the words caught between innocence and fear, before she leaned closer to him, her voice softer than the flutter of a moth's wings yet carrying enough weight to drop his entire world into darkness. "Mommy said, a man helped us after the accident. He kept us safe, but he told her you didn't want us anymore." Arthur felt as if the walls had shifted inward, pressing against him, squeezing the air from his lungs, because deep down he already sensed where this path would lead, and yet he couldn't stop himself from asking, his tone trembling with a dangerous mix of dread and rage. "Luna, do you remember his name?" The little girl hesitated, her eyes darting toward the floor as if the syllables themselves were forbidden, and Arthur's pulse pounded so hard it made his vision blur, his grip on the locket tightening until the metal bit into his skin. Finally, Luna lifted her gaze, her deep brown eyes reflecting both the trust of a child and the sting of betrayal she didn't fully understand, and she whispered a name so familiar, so intertwined with his own life, that for a moment Arthur thought his mind was playing tricks on him, because the man she spoke of was not a stranger at all, but someone Arthur had once considered closer than a brother. someone whose handshake had sealed million-dollar deals and whose laughter had filled late-night offices, someone who had been standing at his side through his greatest victories and deepest losses, his own business partner. The sound of it hit Arthur like a punch to the gut, the room spinning again as the locket slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the hardwood floor, its echo loud and merciless in the suffocating silence that followed. And in that heartbeat he knew that the past he thought was buried had not only come back, it had been living in the shadows all along, smiling in his face while robbing him blind, and now the truth was here, burning like fire through every vein in his body, promising that nothing, absolutely no thing, would ever be the same again. The name burned in Arthur's mind like acid as he tore through the storm, wipers thrashing at the sheets of rain, headlights barely cutting through the darkness, his pulse pounding harder than the thunder outside. He couldn't feel the cold, only the raw, boiling fury surging in his veins, because every mile brought him closer to the man he had once called a brother, a man who had sat beside him in boardrooms, toasted to their victories, shared his table, his trust, his life, and yet, behind a mask of loyalty, had buried the truth so deep that Arthur had lost years he could never reclaim. When he slammed the brakes outside the towering glass office, the building loomed like a cold, unfeeling sentinel, mocking him with its silent perfection, and he stormed inside, leaving muddy footprints across the pristine marble floor, his wetsuit clinging to his body, each step echoing with the weight of betrayal. The security guard hesitated, but one look at Arthur's face, wild, wet hair plastered to his forehead, eyes lit with a dangerous fire, was enough to make him step aside without a word. Moments later, Arthur burst into the office, the door banging against the wall, and there he was, Michael, standing behind the polished mahogany desk as though nothing in the world was amiss, but the moment his gaze met Arthur's, a flicker of something, guilt, fear, maybe both, flashed in his eyes before the mask slid back into place. "Arthur," he began, feigning calm, but Arthur's voice sliced through the air, raw and low. "You knew." And the words hung heavy, trembling with all the unshed years of longing and pain. Michael didn't deny it, not for a second. Instead, he leaned back, sighing as if Arthur were some stubborn child, and said, "I did it for your own good, to keep you focused, to protect the company from weak distractions." The phrase landed like a slap, and Arthur's hands curled into fists so tight his nails bit into his palms, his jaw trembling as he stepped closer, his shadow falling over the man he had once trusted. With everything, the urge to grab him by the collar, to slam him against the wall, to make him feel just an ounce of the agony Arthur had endured, was almost unbearable. But somewhere deep inside, through the roar of rage, another thought pushed its way forward. This wasn't about Michael, not anymore. This was about them, the two little girls in the cabin who had waited, who still didn't know if their father would stay. Arthur's voice cracked when he said, "You stole their childhood from me." But Michael only looked away, silent, which was somehow worse than any denial. Arthur turned on his heel, each step toward the door feeling heavier than the last, because walking away from a fight he could win was foreign to him, but he knew winning here meant nothing if it cost him more time with his daughters. Outside, the storm greeted him with a fresh wave of icy rain, soaking him through in seconds, lightning ripping the sky apart as he ran back to the car, his breath ragged, hands trembling on the steering wheel as he floored it toward the cabin. The wipers could barely keep up, and every flash of lightning lit up the road ahead like brief, jagged memories. Elara's wide eyes, Luna's quiet hope, the way their voices carried the faint echo of a woman he had loved and lost, and each image cut deeper than the last. By the time he reached the cabin, night had settled thick over the woods, the storm still lashing at the windows, wind howling like it wanted to tear the world apart. Inside, Luna sat curled on the old armchair by the window, her knees drawn up, cheek resting against the glass as raindrops traced crooked paths beside her face, her deep brown eyes scanning the darkness beyond as though she could will him into view. Across the room, Elara sat on the rug, clutching her sister's arm, her small voice trembling. "Do you think he'll leave again?" And in that instant, he weight of their fear, their fragile hope, their silent testing of his promises, became the heaviest burden Arthur had ever known. Before Luna could answer, the sound of tires crunching on wet gravel reached their ears, headlights flaring briefly through the rain-streaked glass, and both girls froze, breath caught in their throats. The wind rattled the cabin as the car door slammed, footsteps pounded up the wooden porch, and then, with a suddenness that made both sisters flinch, the door swung open wide. And there he stood, framed by the storm, soaked to the bone, hair dripping into his eyes, chest rising and falling like he'd run through the night itself, his gaze sweeping over them with a raw mixture of exhaustion, desperation, and something else. The unspoken plea of a father who had been lost for too long and was finally ready to fight for what was his. Arthur stepped into the cabin, his clothes plastered to his skin, hair dripping, chest rising and falling with uneven breaths as the echoes of the storm lingered in the walls. The air inside was heavy with the scent of rain and damp wood, but it carried something else, an unspoken tension, a silence so fragile it felt like a single word could shatter it. Luna's eyes locked on him first, wide and cautious, as though she wasn't sure if he was truly there, or just another dream that would dissolve when she blinked. Elara's small fingers clung to her sister's sleeve, her lips parting in a hesitant gasp. For a heartbeat, none of them moved, each one caught between hope and disbelief. Then Arthur's knees gave way, sinking to the worn rug as if the weight of years had finally dragged him down. "I'm not leaving again," he said, his voice rough, trembling like the last leaf in a cold wind. "Not ever." His hands reached for them, not in demand, not in desperation, but in surrender. When his fingers finally brushed to theirs, the world seemed to realign. "I'm your father," he breathed, and the words broke something inside him, a dam he'd kept sealed for far too long. "And I'm so sorry I wasn't here." Luna's breath hitched, and she stumbled forward first, her thin arms wrapping tightly around his neck, burying her face against his shoulder. Elara followed, slower but with no less need, her small body pressing into the other side of him until they were one tangled knot of soaked clothes, trembling limbs, and unspoken forgiveness. Arthur felt the heat of their tears seeping into his skin, mingling with the chill of the rain still clinging to him, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel cold at all. The cabin seemed to exhale around them, the storm outside beginning to soften, rain tapping more gently against the roof, as if the sky itself was granting them this moment. A faint glow slipped through the clouds, spilling thin streams of gold across the floorboards, catching in the girl's damp hair like threads of light. Arthur's eyes burned, not from the sting of the rain, but from the flood of memories he wished he could rewrite. The birthdays he missed, the nights they cried without knowing his face, the milestones that passed without his voice cheering them on. He held them closer, as though his embrace could somehow stitch over every wound. "I promise," he whispered, the words cracking but sure. "The only thing I care about now is you. No flights, no meetings, no excuses." His heartbeat thudded hard enough for them to feel it, a steady rhythm that seemed to say, "I'm here, I'm here, I'm here." Luna's shoulders began to shake, soft sobs escaping her, as if she'd been holding them back for years. Elara's hand crept up to touch his cheek, small fingers tracing the roughness of his jaw, as though confirming he was solid, real, and not just a story they'd been told. "You're warm," she murmured, her voice fragile, almost wondering. Arthur let out a breath that was half a laugh, half a sob, pressing his forehead gently to theirs. Outside, the sun's rays grew stronger, splitting the clouds like a curtain drawing back to reveal a new stage. The air shifted, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine, a quiet reminder that storms, no matter how fierce, eventually pass. For Arthur, the thought of returning to his old life felt absurd now. The deals, the contracts, the endless meetings, all of it shrank in importance until it was nothing more than background noise. The only agreement worth signing was the silent one between his heart and theirs, an unbreakable vow written in the warmth of this embrace. He closed his eyes and breathed them in, memorizing the weight of them in his arms, the way their tiny fingers clung as if anchoring him in place. He realized then that he hadn't just found them, they had found him too, in the wreckage of his own choices. Sometimes, the smallest hands pull you from the deepest cliffs and save you in ways you never expected.